1959, author Harold T. Wilkins would have a book published called Mysteries, Solved and Unsolved, which you guessed covered numerous well-known and not so well-known unsolved mysteries. But it's one of these in particular that Harold would speak on from a more personal experience, which involved his help on a search for 3 missing children. According to Harold, it all began in June of 1906, when 3 kids, who he never names, a 10-year-old boy and his 2 sisters, 3 and 5 years old, simply vanished near a remote area known locally as 40 Acres, which sat near some locomotive engine sheds outside Gloucester, southwest England. The area was rural, of course, and there's not a lot of explanation from Wilkins as to where the children were last seen, or really much anything about them at all. But what he does record is the search. He would state that the area known as 40 Acres was combed extensively in a 3-day search by dozens of volunteers, which included some of the local railroad workers. They were particularly focused on the northeast corner of the acreage, which was bordered by tall elm trees, a thick hedgerow of thorns and brambles, and a deep ditch which separated the field from an adjacent cornfield. The searchers walked up and down this ditch line, inspecting very thoroughly, and checked any nearby place that could have been used to hide, or to hide a body. But in spite of this massive search, not one trace of the children were found. Before long, the story made headlines in all the major newspapers. This in turn caused donations to start pouring into the family's home. The father, who worked for the railway station as a guard, reportedly received so much money that additional staff had to be brought into the post office just to manage all of the mail coming in. But on the 4th day of the search, a huge break would come. And just at the time when everything seemed pretty dire, around 6 a.m. that morning, a man using a plow in a nearby cornfield noticed something unusual. He would go over and look over a hedge into a ditch, and there were the 3 children alive and sleeping. The farmer immediately alerted the police, and shortly after they made it there, he would go to the local newspaper, who had been promising a reward for anyone who could point investigators to where the children might be. But according to the police, this man did not deserve the reward, and told the newspaper not to give it to him, which they were happy not to do. According to the superintendent of the city police, a Nehemiah Philpott, not only did the farmer not deserve the money, but he couldn't prove that he didn't kidnap the children himself, only to try and claim the reward, one that he didn't know would be coming. However, this was a pretty tight community, and the plowman had a pretty good reputation. Plus, his employer, a local farmer, stated that the plowman had never been gone long enough to pull off such a crime. Regardless, he never got the reward money. But that's not exactly the mystery here. That is, what happened in those 3 days the kids had vanished? We don't know, because the case was largely forgotten about. That is, until shortly after World War II, when the boy who had vanished was now an adult, and he was actually tracked down by someone who was doing research on the strange case. And when they finally found the man and asked him, "What happened to you and your sisters during that time that you vanished and were found asleep in the ditch?" his reply was almost too difficult to believe. He stated he had no memory of what had happened. Now, was this a man trying to forget an awful experience? Or did he really just forget it? Or was he not aware of what even happened? And what about his sisters? Their accounts were never followed up on. Actually, that's a big problem with this story. Wilkins leaves everything so vague. But I did my due diligence and began digging through old English newspaper archives, and I found the case. Let me first say, Wilkins' memory was not that great. First off, he was not an older brother and 2 sisters. He was 2 brothers, a Jack and Charlie Vaughn. Secondly, it was not 1906, it was 1908. Likewise, the newspaper story also confirmed that a Charlie Faulkner, the plowman, did find them and did not get the reward. While finally the rest of the story is confirmed by the paper, in which it's recorded that the only explanation the 2 boys had was they had spent 2 or 3 nights in the field, and that was it. The 2 children never elaborated on what actually happened, but the official police detective's view was the boys got lost themselves and got so scared they collapsed, and then they just lay there without making an effort to find their way home. Although Wilkins pushed for a more supernatural theory, like teleportation, which Wilkins reasoned was why the brothers couldn't remember anything. because according to Wilkins, amnesia sometimes accompanies unexplained phenomena. As far as the other theories go, it is possible once the boys got lost, they found a shed or barn nearby where they hid, and then later on, they found the spot in the ditch where they laid down. That would explain why the searchers missed them. Although, it doesn't really make sense why the boys would do that. In fact, it's almost impossible for these boys to have been anywhere near 40 acres due to the large search. So maybe Wilkins is right, and this one we can chalk up to unexplained phenomena. Gustav Batthyány, a Hungarian nobleman, best known for immigrating to England as a young man and becoming a well-known owner and breeder of several thoroughbred racehorses, would donate his entire library to the Hungarian Academy of Sciences before leaving to England in 1838. And it's in this library our next mystery begins, because there is a very strange manuscript located here called Rohonc Codex. Much like the Voynich manuscript, this codex is full of text from an unknown language and writing system, as well as illustrations, whom no one has ever figured out the point of. The origin itself is even mysterious, although on Gustav's catalog of the library, there is a line which reads Hungarian prayers in 1 volume, size duodecimo, and the codex is actually that size. But that is the only information given in the catalog, so it's impossible to say for sure that this is the prayer book. However, taking a look at the codex itself, you wouldn't think it was a prayer book. It's 448 pages, which are 4.7 inches by 3.9 inches in size, with each page having 9 to 14 rows of symbols, which may include letters. Along with it is 87 illustrations, many of which show religious and military scenes. Some of the illustrations appear to show an environment where Christian, pagan, and Muslim religions all coexist. The number of symbols used is astoundingly high, with it being almost 10 times higher than any known alphabet, although most of the symbols are used with very little repetition, which suggests it's not even an alphabet. As far as the paper goes, tests have shown it was probably Venetian paper made in the early 16th century, but that doesn't tell us when this was written, and it's even possible that this paper was used to copy all this information from an original document that has since been lost. However, judging by the illustrations, most speculate that it was created sometime between 1500 and 1700, and that's pretty much it. And now we come to the mystery. What is the language, and what is it for? Well, none of that has been proven yet, although some have suggested that it is a very old Hungarian script, while others have suggested that it is a Dacian dialect of Vulgar Latin. Others, especially scholars in Hungary, think the whole thing is nothing more than a hoax. Modern-day researchers have fared no better, as some believe it's a really complicated cipher that is yet to be cracked, while others believe it is a constructed language, meaning it didn't evolve naturally and was created specifically for this document. But if it's not a hoax, it could be a legit religious text, which would explain all the illustrations, or it could be a legit lost language. Have you ever woken up on a cold morning, still snuggled under the warmth of your blanket, and thought, I'm going to hit the snooze button and sleep 15 more minutes? I'm sure we all have, but what if you could get away with sleeping a little bit longer, like 3 months worth? Well, this next fringe theory might be right up your alley then. 2020, northern Spain. In a cave, which translates to pit of bones, scientists would begin excavating one of the most important fossil sites in the world, and they came across a very interesting find. When going over some of the fossils, which included our earliest ancestors, scientists would find signs of damage in the fossilized bones that caught their attention, because they had seen them before. The marks left on them were the same ones seen in bones of animals that hibernate, specifically bears, which suggests the possibility that the earliest humans coped with the freezing winters by slowing their metabolism and sleeping for months. And it wasn't just a one-off. In the 30-plus years of searching what is essentially a 400,000-year-old mass grave, there's been thousands of teeth and pieces of bones found that were deliberately dumped here, and it probably goes back to the early Neanderthals. But the interesting part is that the fossils showed that bone growth was disrupted for several months each year, and that these early humans were able to survive long periods of time in these frigid conditions with limited supplies of food and body fat. And while the researchers admitted it sounded like pseudoscience, they were quick to point out Many mammals do this, not only bears, but other primates, which could mean we still have the physiology to hibernate. Of course, this would be disputed by many other scientists who pointed to the Inuit peoples as a perfect example. They live in equally harsh, if not worse, cold conditions and do not need to hibernate. But the counter-argument to that is, the Inuit have access to fatty fish and reindeer fat, which takes away the need to hibernate, whereas the Neanderthal would have not had that luxury. So, would you like to hibernate? Let me know in the comments section below. 1965, author/reporter Jess Stern would write a book called Yoga, Youth, and Reincarnation, which detailed his experience along a 3-month study session of Hatha Yoga, one in which he went into with extreme skepticism and came out as a true believer. Hatha Yoga primarily focuses on posture and breath control to prepare your body and mind for deeper meditation practices. It's often seen as a type of beginner's yoga, and it's said to be able to help with problems of tension, weight control, sexuality, and various other issues. The book was a success and is still studied by many who are looking to get into yoga. But it's this book where our mystery begins, because in it, he would detail a woman named Marcia Moore, a 37-year-old writer, astrologer, and yoga teacher. In 1947, she married a man named Simon's Roof, and the two would divorce in 1961 after having 3 children, but not before the family would take a 2-year trip to India where they studied Hindu and other esoteric religions, and had a great effect on Marcia. After her divorce from Simon's, she would marry an additional 3 times before finally marrying an anesthesiologist in the late 70s named Howard Altunian. And this is where things become interesting, because along with her husband, she became a huge proponent of the drug ketamine, even publishing a book with her husband called Journey into the Bright World, which focused on the mind-expanding effects of ketamine. And if you don't know what that is, it's mostly used as an anesthetic, but it can also be used to treat pain and in some cases, depression. It also makes a person feel detached from their body and surroundings, and of course, some people take it for that very reason, just so they can feel the hallucinogenic and dissociative effects. And in this book specifically, the two are writing about the possibilities of using ketamine in conjunction with psychotherapy to improve one's being and mental health. And I should note here that Howard was the one supplying them with ketamine that he got from his medical office. But after publishing the book and traveling around the country giving lectures on metaphysics, the two found a home in the Seattle suburbs surrounded by farmland, lakes, and forest. It's here she became a practitioner of past life regressions, a way of using hypnosis to recover memories from previous lifetimes, which could explain your current traits and talents. She had also claimed to have discovered a so-called portal that served to unlock future lives, alternate dimensions, and supernatural entities. She called this the Bright World, and the only way to get to it was, of course, using ketamine. And in January of 1979, coming off of writing the book that had taken so many years to finish, she got excited about a trip to a conference in Southern California to discuss past life regression. So around the new year, she made all her travel arrangements, prepared her speech, and loaded up her bags. And just as she was about to depart, she vanished. The call to police from her husband would actually go in at 4:38 a.m. on the following morning of January 15th, and the official report would read that she had left the home several hours prior to go to the movies and never came back, possibly suffering from amnesia or other mental disorder from the use of ketamine. He also let police know that she had threatened suicide before. The sheriff's department responded and began a search, finding nothing. Although they did think it was odd she would walk alone at night in freezing conditions, and her friends would later tell police that's something she would never do. Regardless, the sheriff's department did an extensive search over the following month, never finding a thing. The media ate it up too. Here is someone whose father was extremely rich and she was an heiress. See, her dad was Robert Moore, the founder of the Sheraton hotel chain, so that made many question, could she have been kidnapped? Or was this something to do with the occult, which is what her brother suggested? What made things worse was her husband Howard's public meltdown, along with the fact he took over Marcia's New Age newsletter, and he penned several over-the-top entries, many involving his meetings with psychics. But there's one in particular that would start a crazy theory. Howard would claim after visiting these psychics, he was contacted by a third party with a message from Marcia. In it, she stated, and get ready for this one, she was in the fourth dimension, a different form of lifestyle. She had dematerialized her physical matter by changing into the energy of light and transcended to a different level of being. Since there was no time there, she was not aware of how long she had been gone, but she was putting all this in her memory so she could write about it when she returned. She closed by saying, "Tell Howard I love him." Now, I couldn't find out who the third party was that delivered this message to him, or if this was even a physical being, but after the message did reach him, his mental health began to decline, as he had been very much in love with Marcia. Unfortunately, the case went cold. There was just no sign of her, and the media circus didn't help, especially considering her family, who were very conservative and were put off by her obsession with New Age philosophies, kept their distance from the whole thing. But it would take 2 years to at least get somewhat of an answer, cause in a swamp behind a barn about 2 miles from their home, a skull was found. A skull that belonged to Marcia. Law enforcement was soon called, and a county search and rescue team came out and did one huge search, but they never found any additional body parts or bones. Soon, all they had to focus on was that skull, and interestingly, it did have a hole in it, but detectives determined that it was not a bullet hole because there was no bullet in the area and instead just came from natural deterioration. Of course, Marcia's loved ones didn't really go for this. As mentioned previously, her brother, author Robin Moore, who thought the occult had something to do with it, only saw those beliefs reconfirmed, and he now believes she had been killed by witches or possibly a satanic cult. But the police never bought it, and over the years, the general belief is that Marcia died as the result of ketamine misadventure. One line of thought specifically claimed that she climbed a tree on this very cold winter night and shot herself up with all the ketamine she could find. She then either succumbed to the elements or even came down and was eventually killed by a bear or something like that. Regardless, there was no foul play and it was not mysterious, but instead a horrible accident. However, in spite of her husband Howard's claims that he was madly in love with her, he had started dating almost immediately after she vanished, and, according to some sources, he was the lead suspect. In fact, he was already being investigated for a series of sexual assaults before she had vanished, but police could never find any proof that he was involved with Marcia's death. Even after thoroughly searching the home and interrogating Howard many hours, they never come up with anything. Of course, for this one to be on here, we have to have a little bit of strangeness. On the Obscure series, there are no regular deaths or regular disappearances, so that brings us to one of the really bizarre theories in this case, which Howard claimed he received in a message, that she had dematerialized. Some of the New Age community believed, using all of her studies of the metaphysical world, she truly figured out a way to dematerialize and disappeared into the ether. Of course, that doesn't explain the partial skull she left behind, but apparently, this was not just some weak excuse by Howard to just try and throw people off, as Marcia had told people she was working on a way to dematerialize. It was also found in her writings on past life regression that she fantasized about jumping out in front of a truck just to see what existed on the other side. So I'll wrap this one up here. You guys tell me down below, what happened? Terrible accident brought on by way too much ketamine? Was she murdered? Or did she really dematerialize? This next one has very little info available, but I find it pretty interesting. It actually comes from a small article from the New Zealander, a very old newspaper, and this one is in 1852, dated September 29th, and it's here. We are greeted with a letter between the British government official, a Herman Merivale, senior official of the Colonial Office, and Edgar Bowring, a British civil servant. The correspondence between these two men concerned claims by the crew of a ship called Renovation. See, Renovation had reported seeing 2 vessels trapped on a field of ice attached to an iceberg in April 1851. And because this was just 4 years after the ships from Sir John Franklin's Arctic expedition disappeared, the Crown, along with its citizens, were very curious as to if what the Renovation seen were these ships. So the British government, using its colonial office, would reach out to the official in Newfoundland to investigate the claim, specifically if there were any reports that might confirm these ships were essentially stuck on an iceberg. The authorities there would begin their own investigation, which quickly found that it was highly unlikely the vessels atop an iceberg would go unnoticed by all these ships in the region out hunting seals and fishing, and instead suggested the crew seen an optical illusion which can be caused by atmospheric effects on icebergs. Furthermore, the investigation revealed that in 1851, the year before, the no ships from the fleet had been reported missing, further casting doubt. The Crown officially closed the case and published its findings in formal reports to the Empire's newspapers to quell any rumors about finding Franklin's ships, basically showing that they looked into it, and what the crew of the Renovation really seen is open to conjecture, but it was most likely an optical illusion like the investigation found. But it's also possible that there were some ships caught in the ice, since many did fish in the region, but it probably wasn't Franklin's ships. And just because the 1851 report showed no vessels had been lost, doesn't mean they couldn't have drifted into the area from somewhere else. It's also possible that the iceberg itself was just shaped like parts of a ship, since they take on many weird shapes due to melting and refreezing. And of course, the crew of the Renovation may have made the entire story up. June 1996. A woman named Lynn Johnson was driving along a freeway near Cottage Grove, Oregon, when she would come upon something she simply couldn't believe. Up ahead, a creature suddenly jumped into view. She at first thought it was a deer, which is not uncommon in Oregon, but upon getting closer, she soon found this thing was not a deer, and it was moving quickly. She estimated about 70 miles per hour, and it went right across the freeway in what seemed like little effort. This was only made more odd by the fact that this deer was not your normal four-legged deer. Instead, it sprinted on two hind legs, while the front two limbs I assume were close to the body. As she slowed her car down, the creature made this crazy movement, a sharp pivot, and turned to an angle far too tight for most animals, but with a great velocity, and spread a small pair of wings, which Lynn noted seemed to be too small to actually be functional, and leaped up into the sky and flew off, disappearing into the night. Lynn stated she felt that this thing was supernatural in nature. This story comes to us via a book called Monster, The A to Z of Zoo Form Phenomena, written in 2007 by Neil Arnold, and it's basically about strange cryptid encounters like this. But what exactly did Lynn see? Well, the first explanation was actually offered up by the author himself, who jokingly stated it could be the Jersey Devil on tour, and while that's most certainly not the case, it could be a Jersey Devil-like cryptid. But a more realistic take is Lynn actually seen an injured or deformed deer, which may have shown erratic movements that she may have misinterpreted. Of course, this doesn't explain the bat wings or the flying. Next, you get the optical illusion or hallucination theories. Depending on how long she had been driving, she could have been fatigued, and the trees and everything just played a trick on her eyes. Then it's possible she was the victim of a hoax, or more than likely, she was just trying to feed the author a fictional account. But maybe, just maybe, she really did see a cryptid that could be called a deer dragon. Have you ever wanted to be someone else? Then good news, there may be a way, and it's due to some unexplained phenomena known as a fairy blast. You see, a fairy blast is a concept where a person can temporarily become someone else due to supernatural influence, although the person usually ends up becoming a friend or a relative. And while this is largely considered a silly superstition, according to some newspaper accounts from the late 19th century, there were at least 2 confirmed instances of it, although I use the word confirm loosely. First came the story of a woman from Limerick, Ireland, who had a servant named Mary. According to the article, one morning when this woman ran into Mary, she noticed her dialect had changed to a very distinct American accent, or Yankee, as it was noted in the article. Mary herself seemed to know something was wrong, and asked the woman, "Didn't you hear about it, ma'am?" And the woman, seemingly confused, replied back, "Hear what?" Then Mary replied, "Didn't you hear I've got the fairy blast? I'm not Mary anymore. I'm my sister, Ellen." Ellen, for what it's worth, was her sister who had been living in America for some time now, but now she was living in Mary's body in Ireland. The woman was obviously confused and had no idea what she was talking about. So Mary/Ellen calmly said, "I'll be back to myself in a few days, ma'am, but for now, I'm Ellen, not Mary." And over the next few days, she did remain Ellen, or at least acted like it. Everyone began wondering if she should be taken to a mental hospital, But a few days later, she returned to normal and said that the blast had worn off. But this is nothing compared to the second account, that of Lorancy Venom, or Rancy for short, who had begun having these convulsions, including heel-to head contortions that were characteristic of demon possession. But before this had happened, she had told her family that people had came into her room from the previous night, calling to her and breathing onto her face. These people were allegedly fairies, seeking to blast Rancy. Around this same time, she had reported seeing her 2 dead siblings, and even went into trances where she saw angels. Her seizures became so bad that her parents eventually put her in an insane asylum. That's when a Dr. E.W. Stevens, a spiritualist, was brought in by a man named Mr. Roth to investigate. And why he was here to begin with, I could not find. But it was here that Stevens began talking with the spirits that were possessing Rancy, one he referred to as an old hag, Katrina Hogan, and a Willie Canning. He then put Rancy under a, quote, magnetic influence, and from here suggested that the evil spirits be banished in favor of a good one. And Rancy would state, the one the angels long for is meant to come, and she wants to be here. When the doctor asked her who that was, she said her name was Mary Roth. And that, of course, caused Mr. Roth to say, that is my daughter. Mary Roth is my girl. She has been in heaven 12 years. Yes, let her come. We'd be happy to welcome her. As you can tell, things were now getting crazy. But it would get crazier. Mr. Roth would tell Dr. Stevens and Rancy that Mary, too, had been subject to trances, seizures, and violent mania, and often cut herself in throes of madness. But he believed it would be a mutual benefit if his deceased daughter could inhabit Rancy's body, and that's what she did, for close to 4 months. Mary, living in Rancy's body, would then move in with the Roth family, and they swore that her voice, mannerisms, and knowledge of the family's intimate stories definitely proved it was Mary. Mary even told them she had not died, although after a few months, she would tell them she would be leaving her borrowed body about 11 o'clock, and Rancy would return. Mary then directed her father to write Dr. Stevens and tell him she was going back to heaven and Rancy will be all well when she returns. Now the craziest part of this story comes now, because when Rancy returned home, she was fine. Her health stabilized and she never had any more crazy issues like this. She even got married and lived a very normal life, although there is that one small detail that Mary supposedly took over Rancy's body during labor of her first child to spare her from the pain, and she left right after. But really, Mary kinda owed her that much at least. Now we come to the theories, and I really don't want to do them on this one because I really want to believe Mary inhabited Rancy's body, but that's not what we do here. The first theory is that both of these women in these stories had a mental illness known as multiple personality disorder, a condition which a person shows 2 or more distinct identities and personalities, which could totally explain the sudden shift in behavior and speech in both cases. The shift can be a coping mechanism for trauma or stress, especially in the case of Rancy, who had a history of seizures. There's also conversion disorder, which is a neurological disorder in which a psychiatric condition can cause physical symptoms due to stress, and can often result in dramatic changes in behavior, speech, and yes, identity. Again, in Rancy's story, the convulsions and identity changes could be this conversion disorder, considering all the stress she was under. Likewise, Mary in the first story could have been the same exact thing. There's also the obvious one that seizures themselves can cause similar issues, like memory loss or unusual behaviors, like hallucinations and changes in personality. There's also a possibility that in both cases, the girls made the whole thing up and were attention-seeking. But in Rancy's case at least, there was more to it than that. Finally, maybe in both cases, the women were hit with the fairy blast, which caused them to switch places with someone else. January 28th, 1967, Dunstable, England, at a place called Studham Common. 6 young boys, or 7 in some accounts, aged 10 and 11, would go out to play. And little did they know, this day would go down as one of the weirdest mysteries in the history of England. While the boys were running about and playing, seemingly out of nowhere, a blue lightning bolt crashed down in front of them. Startled, the boys looked over the wide open area of grass and seen a little blue man standing about 20 yards away next to some bushes. This man was about 3 foot tall and had a blue beard and was wearing a one-piece suit with a brim derby-type hat and a black belt which carried a black box on the front. The boys also noted he seemed to have a faint grayish-blue glow shining all around him. The boys, like a lot of young boys, were not scared, but instead were curious, so they wanted to get closer and ran towards him, at which point he vanished into a puff of smoke. Then, about 20 yards away, they seen him reappear, and they walked towards him again, and again, he disappeared in a cloud of smoke, reappearing about 20 yards away. The boys soon got an idea. Instead of chasing him all over the place, they would hide behind some bushes and just kinda watch him. So looking through the little bushes, the boys would be surprised when they became aware of some voices, which they described as being continuous babble that they could not understand, and appeared to be coming from inside the bushes closer to them and down the slope to the right side. They began to suspect that this being had friends that had came with him and were now communicating, although the boys would state they never actually seen any movement from the bushes if that was the case. But after this, they decided they should not try to approach the man again. Instead, they would walk out and look down at where he was one last time, and he was still standing in the same spot they had last seen him. And the boys left, and the story would soon be heard by their teacher, a Miss Newcomb, who of course didn't believe it, but she did have them write down separate accounts by themselves so she could see if they matched up. And surprisingly, they did, and when she questioned them more, they seemed truthful. But once the story got out, local newspapers ate it up, along with UFO enthusiasts who took it a little more seriously, and it soon became known as the Little Blue Man on Studham Common. And that's pretty much it, other than the theories. Of course, ufologists have studied the case quite closely, and many have suggested that the blue man was an alien, and that the black box on his belt was actually a receiver, and the so-called blue beard was actually a breathing apparatus, while others take the whole thing in a different direction and suggest a goblin or a fairy. But the most likely theory is simple childhood imagination. Children are particularly prone to vivid imagination, and the blue man was probably dreamed up, maybe after being shocked by a surprise lightning bolt, but of course, maybe they really seen something of the supernatural. Alright guys, you know what time it is. Small Mystery Roundup. A segment for mysteries that just don't have a lot of info, or are just not very interesting. We start with the giant dock spider. This account is very obscure, and hardly any info is available. In fact, it comes from a webpage that accumulates reports of miscellaneous Canadian cryptids, where there's not enough data to do full reports on. Basically, the story comes to us from the Barons River First Nation in Manitoba, from a man who was setting an otter trap. When he got to the place where he was going to put it out, he saw an enormous hairy black spider. Its legs were as thick as a man's thumb, and its eyes were about the size of coins. The body itself was about a foot in diameter, and when the spider lifted off of its resting position, it stood about a foot tall. The craziest part is he thought it had a tail. Of course, giant dock spiders, also known as fishing spiders, are a very real species located in the area, but despite their name, they don't get anywhere near this big. So with that, the most likely theory is that he saw an unusually large giant dock spider, but he exaggerated on exactly how big it was, overestimating its proportions, whereas the tail he thought he seen was just the spider's spinnerets. While another theory is he saw a different species of spider that hasn't been documented yet, or maybe some different type of animal altogether, which means cryptid. Next, we look at eye burn. When it comes to UFOs and aliens, and even unexplained phenomena as a whole, one thing that's often reported by people who witness it is a painful or a burning sensation in their eyes. But what causes this? It's long been thought that this happens due to intense ultraviolet or infrared light, which might emulate from a UFO. In fact, famous UFO investigator John Keel suggested that the effects on the eyes is akin to that caused by extreme sunlight or other forms of radiation, which can cause swelling of the eyelids, itching, and watering. Okay, but knowing that part, it still doesn't explain why the UFOs are actually causing it, and that's the mystery itself. While UV and infrared can cause eye issues, the damage caused by UFO sightings seems to suggest that the crafts are somehow emitting a form of radiation or light that actually causes more damage, which could suggest that these lights are formed of some advanced technology that did intend to cause the said eye damage, or it could totally be unintentional. Others have taken it a step further and suggested that it might not all be from radiation. Instead, it could be a result of just overwhelming your senses, and then your mind, under the stress afterwards, over-exaggerates the effects, leading to the said eye burn sensation. And that wraps it up for this tiny edition of the Small Mystery Roundup. But before we get back to the show, if you all are interested in supporting the channel, check out the Patreon linked in the description below. Now, let's get back to the video. When it comes to religions of the world, we often think about the big two, Christianity and Islam. But what's lost upon many is that of Hindu, the world's third largest religion, with an estimated 1.2 billion followers, or about 15% of the population, which is just behind Islam at 23% and Christianity around 32%. Most of these reside in India, where more than 80% of their population identify as Hindu, and it is also often branded as the oldest religion in the world. And although that has become its moniker, it definitely is not the oldest religion, although the very beliefs and practices that would eventually become Hinduism did start around 1900 BC. The Hinduism we know of today, though, got its start around the same time as Christianity, or did it? That's what our first fringe theory takes a look at, a very crazy claim that the world's oldest religion was actually created fairly recently by none other than the British Empire, as a way to control India. This comes from a 2005 book by a man named Brian K. Pennington, who researched a lot of records and literature from the time, including official documents from the Church Missionary Society and several Bengali newspapers. The book, despite its clickbait title of "Was Hinduism Invented? Britons, Indians, and the Colonial Construction of Religion," doesn't actually claim that the Brits invented the religion. Rather, it claims that once colonization began, Hinduism started to change due to colonial pressures and needing to adapt to the modern age demands of education, urbanization, etc., etc. This, of course, is largely due to the practitioners themselves who would make small changes along the way. And the theory basically postulates that in the 300 years the Brits were there, first as the East India Company in 1612, and up to the British Raj when India was actually under the crown, Hinduism transformed so much that it wasn't even remotely close to the belief system before British contact, because in that time, they took a set of very diverse beliefs and practices and began to mold it into one coherent faith, which was then followed by a majority of the population, and of course, which makes it easier to control them. In fact, when the Brits first arrived, notes from the time show that they frequently compared Christianity to all of these Indian faiths and practices that were so widespread. This allegedly allowed them to influence the development of Hinduism and present it in a more palatable or more Western way. Our next story comes from Pravda.ru, which is a Russian news site / propaganda site that emerged from the newspaper of the same name in 1999. Not only has it been known to stretch the truth, or straight up lie, like most Russian news sources, it has also come up with some unbelievable tales, like headlines discussing a time machine being built in Europe, or alien skulls found on Mars, etc., etc. But the one that brings us to our next mystery is the headline, "Boriska, Boy from Mars, says that all humans live eternally." This story comes from 2004 and was written by a journalist, if that's what you want to call him, Andrei Mikhailov, who relays a story that he was told about a boy named Boriska, or for short, Boris. According to him, he had friends on an expedition to the Volgograd region, and while they were out camping one night, sitting by the fire, a little boy about 7 years old suddenly asked to have everyone's attention. He doesn't clarify here if the boy just showed up or if he was part of this expedition, but I take it that he was part of the group. Anyways, after the young boy had their attention, he told them he wanted to talk about life on Mars, about its inhabitants and how they make flights to Earth. This, of course, was met with silence, but he continued on, where he discussed their civilization, the huge cities of Mars, their spaceships, and their regular travels to other planets. He also brought up Lemuria, the lost continent on Earth, which Boris claimed he actually descended there from Mars, and still had friends there. The boy went on to talk about an hour and a half, and one guy sitting at the fire allegedly recorded the whole thing, which was important because this didn't seem like a boy with an overactive imagination. First, he seemed very smart, way smarter than a typical 7-year-old. Even people who have studied the legend of Lemuria knew less about it than this kid. A lot of it wasn't even in books or online. He spoke like he had been there. Most surprisingly, he spoke like a scholar. He was just so knowledgeable. Of course, it was very possible that he made the whole thing up, right? Not according to the people that were present at this expedition. They claimed that he really came off like he was talking about personal memories, maybe from past lives. The story then takes a turn here as the journalist, after hearing this account, would track down the boy's parents to interview them. This is where he found out that he was born in January 1996, which made him almost 9 years old by the time this account was released. Here's where the story got even crazier. According to his parents, after he was born, he was able to hold his head up in only 15 days, which typically takes a month or two, and he spoke his first word in 4 months and soon began fully talking, forming his first sentence at 7 months old, saying he wanted a nail after noticing one stuck in the wall. By the time he was 1.5, he began reading newspapers and learned all the colors and shades, and by 2, he began painting. Once they began taking him to daycare, teachers there began telling the parents that he had an exceptional memory and unbelievable ability to grasp new information, and sometimes this information came from unknown places. According to his parents, he would begin sitting in the lotus position and started talking about Mars, distant civilizations, and other planetary systems. He started doing this almost daily ever since the age of 2. He told tales of his previous life on Mars, where the planet had once been inhabited but lost its atmosphere due to a catastrophe brought on by nuclear war, forcing the inhabitants to build cities underground. It was around the same time that he flew to Earth frequently for research purposes. Of course, he stayed at Lemuria during all this, the lost continent under the sea, which according to Boris, the continent was consumed by the water after being hit by a massive rock, I assume a meteor, and the island sunk, taking one of the boys that was his close friend with it. Of course, this journalist didn't just want to take this at face value, so he pushed harder. He stated to Boris that Lemuria was said to have disappeared 800,000 years ago, and the land was supposed to be inhabited by 30-foot giants. Was any of this true? And just how did he remember all this? The boy replied, "I do remember." And I guess this was enough for the journalist, because he didn't push back on it. Boris then began talking about a book called In Search of the City of Gods, which mainly deals with the ancient tombs and pyramids. He cited that under one of the pyramids could be found knowledge, something that had not been discovered yet. He also claimed the Sphinx has an opening mechanism behind its ear, where exactly he could not remember, but that it would change life on Earth once it was discovered. He also veered off into how great the Mayan civilization was and its people, citing that we know very little about them. Most interestingly though, Boris claimed now is the time for the special ones to be born on Earth, and Earth's rebirth was approaching, and new knowledge will be in demand. He would even go on to make crazier claims, like other gifted kids similar to him are around the world, but he hasn't met any of them yet. But they are super important to the future, because Earth is going to start changing, with the first major catastrophe hitting a continent in 2009, then in 2013, which of course never happened. Although he did specify he was not afraid because he had already lived through the destruction of Mars. He also made other false claims like Mars would shoot down any approaching Earth vehicles, which I find odd since 7 years prior to this interview, the robotic Sojourner rover had already touched down on Mars. But it would get stranger. When asked about multiple dimensions, Boris jumped to his feet and began spouting all the facts he knew about UFOs, which he would then begin drawing on a blackboard, breaking the unidentified aircrafts into 6 different layers. He would then ask Boris if he had a special mission to fulfill, and if he was aware of what it was. Boris replied he could guess, saying he knew something about the future of Earth, and that information will play the most important role. When asked how he knew this, he simply replied, "It's inside of me." Somewhat strangely, he would close up the interview by asking why people got sick. Boris replied that sickness comes from the people's inability to live properly and be happy. He claimed you should never get involved and mess up other people's destinies, and you should also not suffer because of your past mistakes. Instead, get in touch with what's predestined for you and try to reach those heights and conquer your dreams. Be more warm-hearted, hug your enemy, love those that hate you, and ask for forgiveness and be humble, before finally stating the Lemurians died because they did not develop spiritually anymore, going astray from their predestined path. And of course the journalist would ask one more time, "How do you know?" And Boris simply said, "I know," before saying Kalis, which means hello in the language of his planet. So, crazy story, right? And the theories are pretty self-explanatory. The first being, the whole thing is a hoax. The family was behind the whole ordeal, along with the campers from the expedition, and even the journalist who wrote the account. With the interview, there's a good possibility that a lot of what the kid said was coming directly from his parents, who heavily influenced the narrative. Of course, it could be very true that the kid was a prodigy. Maybe he did have advanced intellectual abilities, which would mean it would be a lot easier to carry out the hoax. Of course, the more unconventional theories is that Boris was recalling memories from a past life where he lived as a Martian or Lemurian, or he was a star child, meaning he was sent to Earth from somewhere in the galaxy to help people here. 2016, Tarzali, Queensland, Australia. A woman named Jackie Liversidge, along with her family, would begin to have some very strange encounters after they began renting a home from a man named Paul Russell. According to Jackie, the strangeness began shortly after they moved in. They at first got the weird feeling of being watched by someone, and that someone could never be located. Chalking it up to just being unfamiliar with the new home, they didn't think much else about it. But the first sign that things were going to get stranger was when they began to hear thumps on the roof, which they eventually figured out came from someone throwing gravel on top of the home. She knew this because the tenant had just laid down rock for the driveway, and when she went out the next morning after hearing sounds on the roof, she found the gravel in the garden next to the house where they had bounced off. It didn't take long after this that her son, outside one night, heard a very loud demonic animal growl, causing him to run inside and tell his mom something was out there. Strangely enough, she had heard the noise prior to this and told herself it was just her imagination. She would relay that, after this, she was in the yard when she heard a big bang, followed by an animal growl, like something was angry that she was getting close. So, she ran inside the home. This strange activity would carry on for months, in addition to hearing someone or something walking around the home. One night in particular, they thought they heard something like a truck idling. The strange part, though, was the sound was coming from the roof and disappeared after about 10 minutes. Finally, Jackie was determined to figure out what was stalking them, so she bought a flashlight and kept it with her at dark. And one night, when she was outside smoking around 9 p.m., she heard the walking. She quickly grabbed the light and saw a creature in the tree, and she called for her niece to come out and look. They described it as being black and hairy and about the size of a chimpanzee. It looked like a monkey though, and turned its head to reveal that it was oblong and had white glowing eyes. It remained in the tree with its arms wrapped around it, and it had its head turned almost all the way around, just looking at them. But that wasn't all. They also seen 2 other sets of glowing eyes, one above the creature on the other side of the tree, and then one in the background. The one above crawled around the tree, stood straight up, and looked at them. Jackie was able to tell that these 2 were mother and a baby, and that the baby was about 6 foot tall itself. But the freakiest part was to come, because in the background, about 50 feet away, behind the tree, was this other set of eyes. This one was about 10 feet high and did not move. It just watched. The being didn't have a neck, and his brown skin was covered in hair. His head was also oblong, and he walked in a bent over position while his arms hung down. She was able to see that the female and baby both had short necks, while the male was so hairy she couldn't really see its neck, but she was able to tell it was built much bigger. The mother and baby then got off the tree, began walking away with long strides, looking back as they did. Of course, Jackie ran in, grabbed a knife, and locked the door. and then alerted her kids. They then listened to the mother and baby making humming noises outside, and the big one was just walking around the home, but soon they all left, to the relief of the family. This story was originally sent in to the YowieHunters.com website, and is strange enough within itself, but it would get stranger, because as you could probably tell, the creatures were supposed to be the famous Yowie, the Australian version of Bigfoot, and that wouldn't really be that odd for this iceberg. But what comes next is, because after the story made headlines in Australia, there would be a follow-up article in which Jackie would claim this family of Yowies were not alone. They had another creature with them. This one she described as a strange-looking pale white guy, like the one all over the internet, which of course she was referring to the hoaxed demon or crawler image that went viral in 2010. She claimed this other creature with them had sunken and hollow cheekbones, but they never glowed, instead completely black. After all these strange encounters, the family would move out, and who can blame them? And that's our mystery, not the Yowies or any of that. But what was this creature that was accompanying them? Well, I'll start with a theory that came directly from the property's owner and tenant, Paul Russell, who said they were looking at nothing more than possums, and insisted he had never seen anything unusual on the property, although it's worth pointing out he had only just bought it himself before he started renting it out. But the most likely theory is Jackie was having some kind of hallucinations, maybe due to anxiety caused by moving to such a rural, isolated area, and her mind was playing tricks on her, so much so that some animal she seen and could not identify made her think of the pale crawler, which was exaggerated from all the stress that she had been going through for months, especially the stress from thinking she was being watched. And then her hallucinations started influencing her family, who also thought they'd seen these creatures. Of course, the other theory is the family really did see some kind of cryptid, or maybe a pale crawler. When European explorers first started their voyages out into the sea, they would return with stories of some of the more fanciful things that they had seen on their journey, maybe none more popular than the mermaid. Heck, even Christopher Columbus would later record seeing mermaids off the coast of Haiti in 1493, where he described them as not so beautiful and said they were more masculine looking. But these stories go much further back than Columbus. It's hard to track down its original origin point, since so much of the mermaid story has been taken from various legends. But the first account of anything that even resembles a mermaid goes back about 3,000 years ago, and it can be traced to a Syrian goddess called Atargatis. But this segment isn't a history lesson of the mermaid, or even about ancient sightings. No, we're going to talk about mermaid sightings in our time. Yes, they still occur. We'll start with the early modern day sighting, which occurred in 1967. It all began with a ferry filled with tourists making its way along the main islands of British Columbia. As they were floating along, soon everyone on board noticed a blonde-haired mermaid sitting topless on the beach, with flowing hair and the lower half of a porpoise. She was apparently eating a salmon she had caught. According to the local paper which covered the story, they stated that a man from Sioux City, Iowa, was even able to snap off a picture, which they printed, and you can see here, while another man flying over the area allegedly got an aerial photo of the creature. The story spread quick, and one local man even put up a $25,000 reward for anyone who could capture the mermaid and prove that it was the real thing. However, in this first account, it came out as debunked, because decades later, in 2016, the full story was told. A journalist named Dave Obey tracked down several people who he believed knew the secret of the mermaid story, and they all pointed to a woman named Judy Allred, and Dave actually found her living in Idaho. And long story short, it was a publicity stunt pulled off to promote a fishing tournament coming up. So Judy wore the mermaid suit and even took a half-eaten salmon with her, and of course, the rest is history. As far as the photo taken from the airplane, yeah, that guy was involved with the hoax, but the photo taken from the guy on board of the ferry really thought it was a mermaid. But although this first one is ruled out, it would become the starting point for the modern day sightings of mermaids, and we are going to take a look at some of the more famous ones. It would be a full 20 years after this that we would get our next big sighting, when in August of 1986, a man named Victor Tannigan was sailing on his way to Singapore when he returned from watch to lie on his cot, when he all of a sudden got the strange feeling that someone was staring at him. He turned to look out the round porthole and see a strange-looking female staring at him. She had dark hair, tan skin, and big blue eyes, bigger than human eyes. They stared at each other for a few seconds before Victor got scared and ran out and called for his colleagues. But when they got back, the mermaid had vanished. This story has a lot of details missing, like, was the mermaid on deck and that's where he seen her? If so, why was she there? Even though it lacked in details, this story would be followed by others that came out in the 80s involving mermaid encounters, like the one in 1988 when scuba diver Robert Foster was below the waters off the coast of Florida and he saw a vague shadowy figure slashing through the waters towards him. The water then began to churn wildly, causing clouds of sediment to swirl. When the figure got about 20 yards away, he noticed arms reaching out towards him, and each arm has sharp talon hands. That's when he saw her breast, along with smooth skin, flowing hair, and a scaled tail from the waist down. This half woman, half fish, as he described it, looked like she had hate in her eyes. Foster was obviously terrified and quickly swam to the top and crawled back onto the safety of his craft. But it's not all mermaids. Sometimes it's mermen, as a Mr. Anibal Perez and his nephew of Puerto Rico explained. They were out on the beach one day with their grandmother when a young man emerged from the waves. He was about 12 years old and apparently had a handful of sand, which he asked the two if they would like to eat, and of course they declined, so the boy ate it himself. He was completely human with thin long black hair and was wearing light-colored yellow shorts. He seemed to copy the two's movements in the water as they had been swimming. At some point, he would dive down and return with algae, which he once again offered to the boys, which they declined again. But after they talked to him for a few minutes, he began imitating their speech. Finally, he said he was from the bottom of the sea, and a few minutes later said goodbye, humans, before he descended back down, never to be seen again. Then we fast forward to 1998, when Jeff Liker and 6 other divers exploring the ocean bottom off of the coast of Hawaii, which was an area that already had many legends of mermaids. Anyways, Liker not only seen one, he took a photograph, as you can see here. She apparently had been swimming with dolphins before this and leapt out of the water and disappeared beneath the surface. He described her as beautiful, nude from the waist up, but it would be about an hour later, as he was diving, that she would swim overhead and he snapped off the photo before she quickly darted off. Supposedly, this was corroborated by 10 other tourists who all seen it, but considering the photo ended up in a bunch of tabloids, it's considered very dubious. There was also one spotted off the coast of Israel in 2009, and this soon brought in a $1 million offer to anyone who could provide conclusive proof of a real mermaid. And surprisingly, Josh Gates with Destination Truth would take this challenge, and after a week of filming, they did come up with some weird footage of something that they thought could be the mermaid, but the footage was too blurry to really draw anything from. This is only a few of the numerous modern day sightings, but there are many more. So what are people seeing? Well, you get the obvious, that it's nothing more than misidentified ocean animals, like seals or manatees, which, from a distance, may resemble human-like forms. And since mermaid folklore is so prevalent, well, that's the first thing that leaps to your mind. Not to mention, if you have been at the sea for hours, days, or even months, you can become fatigued and be way more apt to hallucinate. Of course, there's other plausible explanations as well, like optical illusions from the waves and light reflections, and then of course another theory is hoaxes, especially any that involve photographs. And finally, well, maybe mermaids do exist, or some cryptid that does look like them, and that explains all the sightings. And that brings us to the conclusion of Part 12 of the Obscure Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg Explained. We are now about 1/2 of the way through Layer 4. I hope you guys enjoyed. Goodbye, and good night.